Lacanian Compass. I don't think we need to present you, Eric, because you are well known for all of us, and you have been a supporter and a great friend of the Lacanian Compass since the beginning. I remember after September 11, you came to New York to participate in that wonderful conference, Trauma and its Aftermath. And the last event that we were going to have you in person in the United States was in 2012, but unfortunately had to be canceled because of Sandy. And so since then, we have been looking forward to an opportunity to have you. And because of the pandemic, now we have you virtually, but it's a great honor that you are doing us in sharing with us your wonderful teaching abilities. So I don't think we need to present more Eric Laurent, just to thank him for his willingness to contribute to our development in the United States. Thank you very much, Eric, and we are here for you.
Well, you gave me quite a difficult task today. To comment on chapter 3 of Encore is really something touchy, because let's say the use of all the resources of language are in this text intricated so as to produce the effect that Lacan wanted to produce. That is, we could say, to undo the ordinary meanings of what we call a letter, a reading, and to convey this in the short time we have won't be easy. I try, knowing that probably I won't be equal to the task that I'm confronted with. So, in this text, Lacan starts from a motto: in analytic discourse, situate the function of the written. This chapter 3 is a kind of epistemological treatise of the letter against all ontology of being. The text was written 2 years after Littérateur, from which he takes up and perfects many elements. The chapter begins with a series of paradoxes that, in a Baroque provocation, aim to undo the seemingly obvious link between reading and what is written. Like he said, a letter is something that is read. It even seems to be designed in the extension of the word. It is read, and literally at that. But it is just not the same thing to read a letter as it is to read. Just as he said, the books, his books, writings, published in 1966, were not to be read, it is quite clear that in analytic discourse, what is involved is but that which is read beyond what you have incited the subject to say. So Lacan begins by questioning the evidence of the link between reading and the letter. He proposes an original conception of reading a speech and not a text. Reading beyond what you have incited the subject to say by the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, but reformulated, simplified as saying anything but saying. This reading of the saying defines the unconscious as written by Jacques-Alain Miller in his headings. The unconscious is what is read. The second fundamental term introduced in this first paragraph is the term discourse, with an opposition between the analytical discourse and the current discourse. Analytic discourse radicalizes current discourse. He has the privilege of relying only on what functions as speech in the field of language. And analytic discourse also radicalizes the function of the written, since it is written in a very different way from the letters used in current discourse. Current discourse is written with the alphabet. Analytic discourse is written with 4 letters, 2 bars, 5 lines. How strange. Lacan counts them as one counts in the theory of graphs, the edges and vertices of the graph. He does not omit to name the lack, the line that there is not. Let us reconstruct the schema of this discourse, which transforms the way in which the discourse were written in the first chapter of Encore. If you, I cannot do it. If you go to this first chapter, it's very difficult to read the 4 bars, the 4 letters, the 2 bars, and especially the 5 lines. But if you take this, I will have to change my video, just a minute. If I put it that way, you see that if we reconstruct the writing of the discourse as such, we have the 4 letters, the 5 line, the line that links S1 and S2 that doesn't exist, and the 2 bars I have omitted on the 2 sides of the schema. This is very different as writing of what is in chapter 1, presented here, in which it's much more difficult to read, especially the 5 lines. Let's go back now. Okay. I keep there. So, to specify what he calls analytic discourse, Lacan gives another version of the function of the written in this discourse, other in relation to the first version he gave. The first version was to read the speech. This new version, Miller specifies it as introducing us to the use of the letters plural, that explain the function of this discourse. These letters, in number of 3, are not the ones who note the speech. They are small a, capital A, and phi. Lacan defined them each, giving each time a new sense of what a letter is. Quote, first of all, A is what I call an object, but which, nevertheless, is but a letter. Then capital A, which has 2 functions. First, it includes all that can be written as a proposition in a logical form. Then it names a locus, the locus of the other. Lacan concedes that naming a locus with a letter deviates from the use that set theory makes, in which the locus is noted as a little square. This non-standard notation allows Lacan to develop the function of the letter capital A, adding to it a bar, noting a lack. He develops capital A with S of capital A barred. Thus, he creates the notation of a locus that does not hold. It's a container that includes a hole, a loss. And so, in their function, the first letter A and the second A bar are linked. Quote, object A comes to function with respect to that loss. Lastly, comes the letter phi that Lacan defines as, quote, to be distinguished from the merely signifying phallus that has been promoted in analytic theory up until then with the term phallus. So, Lacan separates the phallus as signifier, writing the minus of castration, minus phi, and the letter phi, capital Phi, who writes the jouissance that cannot be negativated. Having defined, having explained these letters, Lacan will then show how they will affect the function of the signifier, how the registers of the letter and the signifier separate. So we come to the second development in the chapter. I call development the four development numbered by Miller in the chapter. In this second development, Lacan starts to remark that linguistics in the field of language where speech is produced justifies its operations with its scientific approach. He says, linguistics is justified by the scientific discourse. To name that discourse adds a new meaning to the word, since scientific discourse is not written in the four discourses produced in the first chapter. The science-based linguistics was able to separate the signifier from the signified and the function of signification, to measure the importance of this separation. Lacan first recalls how language was viewed by the philosophical discourse. He recalls the effort of Plato in the Crityle, in which Plato continues to maintain that the names have a connection with things, that the signifier in and of itself means something. Having highlighted the linguistic gesture of separation, Lacan, however, rejects the term chosen by Ferdinand de Saussure of the arbitrariness of the sign. Lacan rejected because it seems to him to come not from science, but from the discourse of power, from the discourse of the master. It is enough for Lacan to say that the signifier has no relation with the signified. To use a term related to the master's discourse, says Lacan, change the reference. We have to stop because it's a very original use of the term reference. The reference is no longer an object of the world, but a pure object of language, an effect of language. It is how a discourse connects a subject to a big other, a mode of that other. Quote, the signifier as such refers to nothing, if not to a discourse. In other words, a mode of functioning or a utilization of language as a bond. Bruce Fink chose to translate the French word lien as link. I will try to use bond rather, because you can make a link on the internet between two sites. But between a child and a mother, it's a bond. And also, when someone has a slack relation with the other, he may use bondage to be sure that its bond with the significant other is valid. So discourse is not defined by meaning is use, like it's done in the second Wittgenstein. But for Lacan, reference is bond, social bond. What it's called that way is the mode of other that the subject believes in. In the four discourses, the mode of the other, of the master, the analyst, the historical, the academic, is not the same. Lacan described that bond as between those who speak. The first problem that addresses Lacan is that these beings are living beings. How is life as such connected with discourse? Life is connected in a paradoxical way to discourse by a radical signifying ambiguity. The dimension of sex is introduced through its inevitable connection between life and death, since reproduction as such, insofar as it is sexual, involves both life and death. The mode of connection between the speaking beings defined a world. Does this lead to any conception of the world? Immediately asks Lacan. Conception of the world is a German word. It's Weltanschauung, a notion first introduced by Kant in his critique of the faculty of judging. It is, quote Kant, the power that allows us to fully understand the infinite world under one concept. Heidegger, in his comment on Kant, calls it an image of the world. Quote Heidegger, "The world in the measure of a conception does not mean an idea of the world, but the world itself as grasped as what can be, of what we can have an idea of. It's the world arrested and fixed by man in representation and production." Lacan is here closer to Jaspers, who in his Psychology of Worldviews, a book written in 1919, asked the question of, quote, whether philosophy in general could be considered as the worldview, and conversely, if any worldview was the equivalent of a philosophy. So it is to philosophy that Lacan assigns the idea of the world as a whole and recuses this for psychoanalysis. After having evoked philosophy, he passes to Marxism, who for Lacan does not seem to allow also the perspective of a conception of the world. This judgment about Marxism, coming after the opposition between philosophy and analysis, is part of the spirit of the 70s, in which Marxism and psychoanalysis were related, as Althusser and Lacan were. Lacan advances something that rings with the Althusserian Catholic formation when he says that Marxism is for him a gospel, not a lay religion, as others have said, but, quote, the announcement that history is installing another dimension of discourse and opening up the possibility of completely subverting the function of discourse and of philosophical discourse insofar as a worldview is based upon the latter. More precisely, what Lacan is aiming at is the ontology and its use of the word being that gives us the false impression that words give us access to the world. The world, the verb to be, is criticized by Lacan in a number of ways. First, he notes that it's not universal in languages. We know that it's in the Indo-European family of languages that we have the copula. Unlike the Chinese languages, for instance. to ruin the prestige of the verb to be, Lacan also proposes to resort to an ironic use of writing. He writes the phrase, "It is what it is," in such a way that the word disappears into a new phonetically written word, translated happily by Fink as "it is what it is." This kind of procedure that the French writer Raymond Queneau highlighted, that Lacan appreciated, at the same time, the works of Queneau and his use of the phonetically written words, like in his masterpiece, Zazie in the Metro. Lacan wants to ruin the prestige of the verb to be because it was a discourse of the master who promoted to be in his closeness to philosophy. Lacan will make a detour with precisely the Plato, Aristotle perspective on being. Aristotle, who rejected the unifying conception of being in Plato, stated famously that being is said in several senses. Lacan points out two of them. Aristotle first opposes being as such and the quiddity of a thing. Bruce Fink translation says that it juxtaposes, but the French says opposes. Being as such and quiddity, the particular of what it is. To tst in Greek. And to designate being, Aristotle used another phrase, to tnni, which Lacan translates as the being that was going to happen. Quote, what would have happened if that which was to be had simply come to be? Lacan stresses that what in other texts of Aristotle is qualified as essence, in this phrase, to tnni, is not a stable essence, but a process. What would have happened if? In his note to the translation, Bruce Fink mentioned the two translations by Ross of to tnni as what was to be and essence. The crucial point there is to oppose the process who, let's say, like in the Chinese Tao, a process that could fail, the result, the stable essence, giving the false idea that we have named something. In this desire of philosophy to establish stable meanings of the words, allowing contemplation in Plato, theoria, or science in Aristotle, Lacan discerned the desire of the subject who speak that things would respond to him, would obey him. This desire was beforehand isolated by Lacan as the discourse of magic. For instance, in this 1965 text on science and truth. Magic is the direct response of the world. Quote, it presupposes the signifier responding as such to the signifier. The signifier in nature is called by the signifier of the incantation. The thing, insofar as it speaks, answer our objurgations. As in magic, from the point of view of the master discourse, it is the being who responds, the stable being. Quote, it's quite simply being at someone's boot, being at someone's orders. What would have been if you had understood what I ordered you to do? In magic, whoever utters the incantation waits for nature to respond. The master, for his part, utters the signifier and waits for it to produce the bond produced by the command. The signifier is, first and foremost, imperative. We see why it was crucial for Lacan to dismiss the Saussurean term of arbitrariety. The effect produced by the false imperative bond produces an illusion, the illusion of a pre-discursive reality. There is no pre-discursive reality. Lacanian comments on that in a text called The Dream of Lacan. You know that any reality occurs through a discourse, but I quote, but also necessarily it is thought as antecedent to the discourse. Once produced by a discourse, the reality is posed as a prerequisite. Miller continues. The real effect is of the same time at what Lacan calls the subject supposed to know effect. In the analytical process, something is found. Then we are led to assume that there was already another in which this was deposited, who moreover knew of it. Once suppose the effects of the real as dependent on discourse, Lacan moves on to analytic discourse and shows an effect on current discourse, on our common use of language. In the analytic discourse, we speak of sex. Lacan even uses the very 18th century word of foutre, at the same time substantive come and verb to fuck. But unlike the erotic novels of the 18th century, who describe what goes well into sex, in psychoanalysis, we say that it's not working out in sex. This is also what the current discourse does. But in it, we complain over and over again for nothing. Everyone can complain in the field of the common use of language. But this is the field where all discourses drown themselves. These discourses drown in the complaint that in the sexual something is wrong. They drown in that meaning. Lacan then states the way in which the current discourse tries to escape the droning of that meaning. He plays on the homophony between décence and the decency that comes from the Latin decet, which means it's appropriate and has nothing to do with meaning. Décence can be separated in a prefix dé and sens. In his translation or in his note, Bruce Fink sees an homophony with décence in the plural and decency. I prefer to stress the fact that dé is a prefix that marks a reverse of an action, like, for instance, in détour, détour en français. You make a tour, but when you make a détour, it's a reverse of what you wanted first to act out. So I rather see the homophony between dé privative sens, because otherwise you could not explain why Lacan says that in the current discourse, everyone speaks about it as little as possible. This is not decency, it's rather no-sensy. The current discourse, the common use of language, can repeat that things are not going well between men and women, which makes the basis of life, as Lacan says in this curious phrase. But the common discourse wants to forget that. It makes it work through conventions, prohibitions, inhibitions, but it takes the analytic discourse for this complaint to be logically ordered. To obtain that, the analytic discourse implies that men, women, and children are only signifiers. They are not pre-discursive realities. Precisely what this reduction to men, women, children as signifiers, what does that mean? Will be explained at the end of the following development, number 3 in our chapter. The male and female signifiers, man and woman, are to be defined in the analytic discourse only in their relations with the 3 letters, small a, capital A, S, capital A barred, and phi. A woman, as logically defined in the analytic discourse, has relations with S, capital A barred. A man with the phallic jouissance and a child is the object A who answers for a woman to the loss inscribed in the other that she has a special relationship with. To say that there is no pre-discursive reality means that men and women are not looking for each other because of their anatomy. Destiny is not anatomy, but logic. Lacanian biology starts from the impact of logic on the living as such. Lacan passes then to a third development. In which he will specially comment on the letter, the bar, and the forcing. The 2 uses of the letter, the literary one and the mathematical one, are distinguished, and they can enter in opposition. Especially when we consider the role of the bar. It is not enough to say that the signifier and the signified are distinguished. There is a bar that separates them, and Lacan gives it radical scope. He says, the signified has nothing to do with the ears, but only with the reading of the signifiers we hear. And this radical reading is possible only because there is a bar between S, capital S, and S. Lacan tells us then about his reflection on the multiple uses of the bar as notation. For instance, as implied in the notation of negation, or rather, as modes of negation in the plural. While Lacan has not yet made public his formulas of sexuation, which will come 2 months later in chapter 7, titled A Love Letter with an accent on the word love, an added letter precisely. But here in chapter 3, Lacan tells us, quote, the negation of existence is not at all the same as the negation of totality. That is exactly the propriety we use in the formulas of sexuation. The bar, he tells us, is not to be understood, but to be explained, reformulating the use of the philosophical opposition between the two attitudes. The understanding and the explanation. The explanation specific to the scientific discourse is what it takes to account for the uses of the bar. And he gives us an explanation of the use of the bar who questions a limit of linguistics. In linguistics, it is difficult to account for the effect of meaning produced by the effects of the signifier on the signified. This is a topic already addressed differently by Lacan in Littérateur. In which the dimension of the letter implies a certain instance, a certain insistence, a certain forcing to include itself in the framework of the signified. In Littérateur, he says, recalling the instance of the letter, its text of 1957, called The Instance of the Letter in the Unconscious, or The Reasons Since Freud. And he said that this insistence designate in the letter which to insist is not there by right, however strongly it advances its reason. To understand what Lacan means by signifiers injected into the signified, we have an example, for instance, in the publication of a letter exchanged between the poet Francis Ponge and Lacan in the journal La Cause du Désir, number 107. This letter dates from a year after the publication of Littérateur. Lacan passes to Ponge a question formulated by Jacobson. Is there any example of poetry in French, where there is an insistence on the violation of the grammatical accord, the dysfunction of the singular and the plural, or the genre, or the change between the postposition and the preposition, etc. By conveying the question, Lacan formulates it in the terms in which he evokes the insistence of the poetic letter to violate the syntactic regularities. Lacan does not shy away from the aggression and violence inflicted by the letter's syntax, or the letter on the syntax, by speaking of insistence on violation. What interests Lacan is the poetic writing is its break-in, the irregularity. The reference to the work of the avant-garde American poet E.E. Cummings highlights his desire. In Encore, Lacan gives us an example of the effects of the forcing of the letter in a reading of the current discourse and the analytic discourse of the same expression, there is no sexual relation. In the current discourse, the statement can be written X are Y, men are woman. But the significant terms of current use have no relation to the articulation of these signifiers with the logical functions revealed by the psychoanalytic discourse. At the level of the sexual relation, at the level of the phallic question, the woman, who in the analytic discourse does not exist, can only be grasped as a mother instead of the woman. Similarly, the logical reading of the mother-child relationship transforms what Freud placed on the side of the ideal. Being a mother becomes a supplementation for the not whole on which woman's jouissance is based. So the child fills this absence, embodying the object A as a letter that comes to mark the place of the absence. As for man, he is articulated to what is noted as phallic jouissance, with the peculiarity that for him it is functioning as a whole. It's not that woman is not linked with the phallic jouissance. She has that link, but under the logic of the not whole. So we come to the fourth development of the chapter. It begins with a formula that is like a leitmotif on each of the four developments. The letter is the effect of discourse. And Lacan plays with this repetition. He says, not that I repeat myself, but what I've said before makes sense after. And surprisingly, he declares that 15 years ago, he spoke of the first time of the letter. We can trace that moment back by the mention of the proper name of Sir Flinders Petrie. This reference was made by Lacan in the last session of the year 61 on December the 20th of a seminar on identification. It should be noted that it is 4 years after his conference of 57 on the instance of the letter. So why to say the first time was in 61? In this lesson of December 61, Lacan refers to Bertrand Russell as the one who, thanks to a theory of sets, wanted to reduce the mathematical discourse to logic, to a game of letters. And then he develops the dispute about what a proper name is between Russell and Mill. Russell makes it a word to designate the particular. He says, name is a word for particular. Mill speaks of the proper name as a word, as the mark. Lacan then follows the history of the mark in the history of writing, from the line of the Magdalenian prehistoric hunter to the lines of the cuneigraphic or hieroglyphic writing. He remarks that all first marks starts from something figurative, but that by its use, it erases the relationship with the original meaning. The mark implies the erasure of the meaning. In Littérature, Lacan will talk about the first bouquet of the line and its erasure. Then Lacan allows him to state that in their developments on writing, neither logicians, no archaeologists, no linguists have spotted something. Quote, "It seems to me that no one has noticed before that everything happens as if the signifiers of writing were first produced as distinctive trademarks." What does that mean? It means that Lacan reads the history of writing in reverse of the common reading. In the common reading, the historians of writing shows us how marks were used to adapt an easy notation of speech. Lacan reads that at reverse. Even though these marks were used, finally, to note phonemes, the writings were already there, not adapted, coming from something that has nothing to do with language. It was necessary for the writing to be vocalized to realize that this dimension of language, the marks, the writings, was already there. In the identification seminar, Lacan generalized his approach of his injunction of the letter, saying, I quote from him, every time there is an advance in writing, it is because a population has tried to symbolize its own language, its own phonetic articulation, using writing materials borrowed from another population, and which was only apparently well adapted to that language. In fact, it is never well adapted. And I can conclude, this is the key.
Souhaitez-vous que je vous appelle Lys?
No, Siri has
Je ne suis pas en mesure d'effectuer de changement dans vos contacts. Vous pouvez le faire directement dans...
Siri has its own moods. So, Lacan concludes on the key of the seminar identification. The, quote, the characteristic of the proper name is always more or less related to this bond, not to sound, but to writing, to the mark with the direct designation of the signifier as an object. End of the quote. So, it is this stance, this original conception that Lacan had in the 60s, which allows Lacan to say in 73, in our seminar, that he spoke in 61 for the first time of the letter. He recalls his starting point, but extends it by its relation to discourse. The trademarks on the pottery, which were used as letter, have been produced to serve as distinctive trademarks in a market, which is the effect of an economic discourse. Once this branding effect is obtained, then they can be used for something that has nothing to do with the connotation of the signifier. Lacan talks about connotation in our chapter, to separate himself from the process of denotation. A horse, a hack, and a steed have the same denotation. But in one case, the connotation is neutral, in the other, it's familiar, and in the last, poetic. Lacan proposes to generalize his idea of perfection of the connotation to the history of different languages. He proposes to study how, in the context of the social bond of a language, the letters that were used to note the language itself came out. For the Chinese, we know that the things were done very differently from the Phoenician and Greek letters. It can be said that further remarks by Lacan on the writing in Chinese or in Japanese go exactly in this direction of study. The history of notation in languages is thus presented as the specific articulation of discourse and the letter each time. Similarly, for the discourse of science, Lacan wants to distinguish the use of the letter in algebra, the discourse of mathematics, and in the logic of set theory. This separation shows that Lacan is not a logicist. He doesn't want to reduce mathematics to logic as Russell did. The real of mathematics is not real of logic. This is why Lacan was able to say that logic was the science of the real. He could say that only if logic is the discourse devoted to demonstration as such, then it is the science of reality as such. Miller, commented, said that on the text I quoted before, Un rêve de Lacan. The real produced by scientific discourse doesn't make a world. Lacan notes the complexities of the standard model of atomic particle operation to note the peculiarity of the quark. He could have added today the saga of the demonstration of the existence of the Higgs boson and the questioning of the validity of the standard model in front of aberrations of behavior of particles recently seen. To say that there is no world is also to say that the world is rendered illegible by the production of the letters of science. Lacan comes to contemporary literature influenced by science in a way it produces unreadability. 2 years before his Joyce seminar, Lacan talks about Joyce perfecting of language by playing with writing, which makes him not legible. Lacan says it's not translatable into Chinese. But we can say at least the Japanese, who are hard workers, tried it. There is now 3 translations in Japanese of Ulysses since the 30s, and 3 of Finnegan's Wake. The latest dating from approximately 2 years ago. Daisuke Fukuda, which is a student of Lacan, a Japanese student of Lacan, has written on that. Before saying in 75 that Joyce is unsubscribed from the unconscious, Lacan says here in Encore that Finnegan's Wake is what is closest to the slip. Enfin, the lapsus, Freudian lapsus, giving thus a new sense to this term. I quote, that is to say, that it can be read in an infinite number of different ways, but it is precisely for that reason that they are difficult to read, are read only, or not read at all. And then we come to the end. Lacan introduces quite a difference between reading and getting read. Lacan ends this chapter with a very beautiful apologue, which situates the mode of reading in psychoanalysis as reading oneself or getting read, with the same reflexive effect that Lacan gave to the drive. The drive is acéphala. It consists of se faire in French, reflexive, getting seen, getting shitted on, getting eaten, getting ordered. It is this reflexive, acephalous mode that makes Lacan say, then we are in the register of analytical discourse. It's not only the reading, it's a reading of oneself. This apologue, the apologue, repeats exactly the beginning of the chapter, but displacing it after all the developments we went through. At the beginning of the chapter, Lacan says, it is quite obvious that in analytical discourse, it is only a matter of what is read beyond what you have incited the subject to say. At the end, we go from reading to getting read. Lacan questions not only the unconscious, but the subject of the unconscious, the bond he maintained with the other of the psychoanalytic discourse. So goes the apologue. In the great book of the world, one can see the flight of bee. It goes from flower to flower, it forages. Lacan calls the fact that we know that she carries the pollen of one flower on another at the end of her legs, a reading of her flight, coming from the scientific discourse. So to read the flight of bees is to know what they are used for, the reproduction of plants. Of course, it's not hazard. The fact that Lacan speaks about an apologue of reproduction in the world. For the speaking beings, they also speak about their reproduction as such. This sexual reproduction and what in their flight from one being to another does not function. And he comes on, the low flight of birds say that a storm will come. And he asks the question, but does the swallow reads the storm? the text ends with the sudden switch to a you. Lacan says, in your analytical speech, as if Lacan would answer someone, as the figure of an analyst was slipping into the text. His analytical discourse. The subject on the unconscious, unlike the swallow, is a living one that you presume to know how to read. It's nothing else, says Lacan, your history of the unconscious. And he adds a very nice and simple definition of the path of an analysis. You assume this subject can learn to read. And then comes the final shock, quote, only what you teach to read, you teach him to read, has absolutely nothing to do with what you can write. The pass procedure in our school is a good way to report on how a subject reads in an analysis and how he learned to read during his analysis. But what you, the analyst, can write about this pass are letters that refer to logical functions that the experience of psychoanalysis reveals. Small a, capital A, phi. The equivocals of language, which makes the unconscious, have no relation with these letters there. So, definitely, the subject of the unconscious is not psychological.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this excellent reading of the chapter. I invite, if you will, I'm asking you if you will take some questions and remarks.
Of course.
Okay.
I've been longer than I thought I would be, but I read my text slowly, so it took longer. Okay. I hope it was not too long.
No, it wasn't. So raise your hand if you want to make some comments or questions. So we have Mercedes Acuña from Houston. Mercedes, go ahead. You can open your microphone, Mercedes.
Thank you, Juan Felipe, and thanks, Eric, for this presentation. It's just a comment that surprised me too much when I was reading to find that Lacan go back to the logic of the time and the assertion of the that text. That is, let me read it again. Logic of time and the assertion of anticipated certainty that brings identification and brings about the letter as a support of the subject. I came to realize that letter has an effect on the subjectivity. Can we think that intersubjectivity is the antecedent of bond? and we think about that because bond is a translation of Bruce think. And I was reading this text of Lacan, and I found intersubjectivity. So I was thinking it can be an antecedent, a conceptual antecedent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes.
Interesting. Yes. Lacan had with intersubjectivity a complex relationship. Intersubjectivity was quite used in the phenomenological approach. Intersubjectivity was used by Lacan in a variety of meaning. But in one instance, for instance, he said, the transference is an obstacle to the intersubjectivity. Because in transference is not a relationship between two subjects. It's a relationship between an object or the analyst as an object and the subject at stake in the analytic session. That's why he writes in the analytic discourse a line and then the S barred. So in this perspective, it is a critique of intersubjectivity conceived as a direct link between two subjects. We could say also that another critique is to say that a subject as such is not defined by its relationship with another subject. It's defined with the fact that he cannot be this subject, cannot be fully represented by the S1, and so there is always a connection with the S2. And this kind of flight of impossibility defines the subject always between two signifiers and not in a relationship with another subject. We could say also that the labyrinth of the relationships between men and women is an objection to the intersubjectivity. There is no intersubjectivity between men and women. But as you said, intersubjectivity was used as an antecedent. Lacan borrowed it from the phenomenological discourse, using it, it's true, as the way in which the philosophical discourse could give an account of the bond linking the speaking beings. And we could say that his last objection was the fact that the discourse is not a link between subject, but the link that one subject has to an other, capital other, and which can be repeated. So in a way, this antecedent is also an illusion.
We have two more raised hands. So first, Isolda Alvarez from Miami. Isolda, go ahead.
Hi, Eric. Thank you very much.
Right?
I have two questions. One is related to the phrase that you highlighted, which is the letter is an effect of discourse. So when we say that the letter is an effect of discourse as a mark, right? It's an effect that we can understood more in the sense of like a leftover. There is a discourse and this mechanism, and then as a leftover, we have the letter, and not that much in the sense of the Aristotelian sense, like cause and effect. That's the first one, the first question. And the second one, because it's quite, the concept of the letter is quite, at least for me, is quite complicated. So could we establish kind of a link between the letter, the S1, and the jouissance, the one jouissance, or the one that is called the one all alone? If there is a relationship or there is different things? Those are my two questions. Hopefully I was able to transmit it like well.
Excellent. No, quite consistent questions. Perhaps we could take the second question that was, and perhaps I could try to
Sure.
answer both of them.
Sure, Maria Cristina, go ahead.
So first of all, thank you, Eric. This was truly a masterclass that you gave us, teaching us also how to read Lacan. And so I have three thoughts that maybe I can formulate in a question. So this chapter is about the written, the function of the writing, but we end up with reading. And so the question of reading, the analyst reading what it's heard, and also reading oneself, which will be the end of the process of analysis. But at the same time, there's the reference to Joyce, right? And the question that it can be read in multiple infinite ways. So in this learning to read oneself, there is also the question of a choice. In this process of analysis, choices are made. Will you care to add or comment or maybe tell me that I am completely wrong in reading it this way?
No, not at all. So we have, yes, three questions that alludes to, let's say, separate way of approaching this letter or as an effect of discourse. First, when Isolda says the letter as an effect of discourse is left over. Yes. We could rather say it's a product. It's a product of the discourse. But the product has a lot of relations with the leftover. Like our contamination with all our products gives an idea that all this is left over. The letter in, let's say, Aristotle logic is used, especially by Lacan, as it's useful because it introduces a whole not the whole, but a whole in language. When we say all men are mortal, and we, instead of men, we put an X, a letter, it introduces a whole in the language and in all its significations. Letters are, in that way, they have a special topology. And it's true, a topology that includes the whole. And at the end of his teachings, Lacan produced a new writing with the knots. And the knots include at the same time a consistence and a whole. It's a kind of letter that at the same time makes a connection, includes a whole, and has a certain consistency in the distinct, let's say, all the way in which the whole of language can be rounded by the chains of signifier. That's why this new way of writing that Lacan proposes with the knots, these new letters, in a way. At the same time, they can find a place, a topology for the S1, for all the signifiers, and also for the whole of jouissance that marks the body and the body of signifiers. And also, this mode of writing is specially designed to show how, with the letters, the chain of significations can be distorted, can be topologically transformed. Can be developed, and also how they can include not only the development of chains, but also the cut. And this can make a transition with the question of Maria Cristina. The multiple, the infinity of readings. Maybe infinity is slightly exaggerated, but at least the multiplicity. Each time an analyst makes an interpretation, it's a choice. In Seminar 11, Lacan says that it's a wrong conception to say that interpretation is open to all meanings. That was the phenomenological approach. in which the good thing was to maintain the questions open, to maintain the questioning open. And rather, Lacan says, an interpretation is always to operate a cut, a choice, a separation, because it has to aim to the jouissance that's at stake. You have to aim in this multiple flowering of equivocal aspects. You have to aim in your interpretation to the place or the object, which is at the same time, in our paradoxical statement, the place of an absence. So like I said, for instance, I stressed in the paper I made for the NLS Congress on interpretation, I stressed the fact that it was void, the interpretation. To aim at the object is at the same time to aim to produce a void, a cut in the chain that the subject develops.
Thank you.
We could say that, just the final word, Jacques-Alain Miller said once that interpretation, if it's left in the hands of people who don't know how to use it, they just stick to the listening. They maintain the listening open. I want to listen to you. That's absolutely the reverse of the perspective of interpretation. I listen to you only insofar as I will operate some cuts in what you say that will have an impact on you. I won't stay quiet. And so that implies the active, let's say, use of letters in the sense that Isolda spoke about, an active use of letter to know, to locate what the jouissance is at stake. For this, you have to use the apparatus of letters that, from the analytical discourse that will operate on the common use of discourse, that we make function in the analytic session.
Thank you. One more raising hand. Renata, go ahead, ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Henrique Laurent, for this amazing presentation. Can you hear me, guys, now?
Yeah.
Now,
yeah, I think I was talking without. Okay, thank you so much, Henrique Laurent, for this amazing presentation. I'm very curious about what you mentioned regarding the connotation and the denotation in, different languages, especially Chinese, Japanese, and I've been working quite a lot your text about the Tao of the psychoanalysts to write a paper, and I was really and I think it touched, when I was reading the chapter and also listening to you now, it really struck me some liaison, some bound, to not say the word link, between the Tao and your text and this chapter. Because there you say that you found that the letter has a different relation and has a disconnection from the signifier, in which instead of the relation of S1, S2, we would find A S2, which will create a completely different relation, not a relation between subject and object, but a relation between subject and subject. So I don't know if you have anything to say about it or to help me clarify some points.
Your questions take some aspects of the first question we had. The relationship between subject and subject is, in Lacan's perspective, highly suspicious. The subject has relations with signifiers and objects. And the relationship between subjects is rather left aside as an illusion. We have to have a relation between subject and subject. We have to always include the capital other as such. So it's true that Lacan had always had, since, let's say, the Chinese, he learned during especially he had time to study Chinese during the war. He could not attend patients, so yes, he wanted to do something. And since the School of Chinese in Paris was just in front of his office, he went there to learn, to study with Paul de Miéville, and which was a brilliant teacher. And he maintained his interest precisely for the Chinese language and his peculiarities. Like he said, it's a language in which the word faire, to do, is also a conjunction. The way, in Wu way, the no, don't act, the no acting in Wu way, is also in the way a conjunction. So it ruins let's say, the prestige also, not only of the word, of the verb being, but also of the verb doing, which has such importance for us. I wonder how the Chinese have translated the Nike advertisement of just do it. Precisely, it introduces a whole, let's say, a whole deconstruction, if we could use that Derridean term, of some evidence that the language traps us in.
So we're going to take the last question from Jose Armando Garcia, Miami. Go ahead, Jose Armando.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Well, first to Mr. Laurent for his presentation, I just wanted to I just wanted to sequence to see if I follow some of the premises of his lecture today. So along the work of Lacan, you can definitely follow, you can see different impossibilities in proportion that I would name, namely par rapport sexual. You know, the most noticeable, of course, is there is no rapport sexual between men and women. What is important is to notice that Lacan, although he mentioned that there is an impossibility there, he also makes special emphasis in saying that although there is no rapport sexual, there is a rapport to jouissance. It's almost like, to use a very famous, popular saying in police investigation, it's almost like he's saying, follow the money, follow the jouissance. I mean, it's not between men and women, but there is a rapport, most definitely. In fact, he places first between the par rapport sexual between women and men, he places first, if I recall correctly, the narcissism, later the phantom, and by means of the phantom, by following the phantom, he actually prescribed to follow what phantom lead to, he end up with the object A. There is another impossibility or divorce, and that I believe is taken in the Truth and Science. And there is a divorce between truth and knowledge. However, that allows Lacan to follow, once again, the money, follow the jouissance, and find something of the real between those two. Now, Laurent brought a merely new impossibility between what is read and what is written, if I understood you correctly. There is not correspondence, proportion between those two. I wonder if you place in between those two the letter as something to follow, as the jouissance to follow in between that impossibility. Thank you.
Thank you for this development, quite intricate. You thought about it. It's quite articulated, yes, as a question. I would say that to follow the jouissance was the starting point of when he
lost you for a second, Laurent.
When he said that in Baltimore, from his window, he could see the sign, enjoy Coca-Cola. And he said it's a difficulty to follow the jouissance in a language in which to enjoy is transitional. Whether in French and other languages, we enjoy from Coca-Cola. On jouit de Coca-Cola and not. So it's the intransitive and the transitive there is a difficulty between the articulation. There is no, to state it quickly, there is no quick relation between the subject and the jouissance. So it's not that easy to follow. And that's why, like you said, Lacan went through the fantasy, the symptom, and the ultimate developments about the Joyce, the symptom, etc., to follow the jouissance. It's true. So I would say that I would accept your development as an excellent way of following the path of the letter in its intricate relations between how it can circulate between subject, object, the jouissance and everything that can be isolated as functions within the analytical discourse, as logical functions, who can be then reduced to a letter. Fine, that was point to travel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Eric Laurent for taking your valuable time and be with us today. Thank you to the Lacanian Compass members that are present today. And I'm going to finish this encounter. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.